Writing exposition is tough, especially in a video game, and even more especially if it's a giant sprawling world in a genre like fantasy or sci-fi. There are so many things that really do have to be explained, whether it's story details or mechanics, and it's very tantalizing to take the easy way out and just have a giant exposition dump of scrolling text right at the start. However, the art of writing good exposition is getting rid of as much of it as you can, and hopefully you'll leave this video with a few tips and things you can do with your writing to avoid these massive walls of text. Also, yes, I know Star Wars isn't a video game, however I included their signature opening crawl here as it is one of the few examples of scrolling text done right. While generally speaking, scrolling text exposition is awful and this video will provide alternatives to it, you should also keep in mind that these are just general guidelines and are not set rules. As for why the Star Wars opening crawl is good, my take is that it's setting the stage and is summing up information that wouldn't be more interesting or relevant if shown visually. It's a quick prologue that gives backstory without taking up too much time, and that is the best way to do scrolling text. Now, moving on. When I say environment, what I really mean is environmental storytelling, which is the art of using the visuals and settings the characters find themselves in to create a narrative without the need for words. Environmental storytelling is basically just the idea of show, don't tell. Instead of explaining something, show it visually. Writing good exposition is all about breaking it up and making it more digestible, and the most digestible way to do it is by simply allowing the player to experience it. You don't have to explain everything. If a character has just stumbled across an abandoned cabin in the mountains, using environmental cues such as a grave, a half-dug hole, or a pile of chopped logs will do so much more for explaining the history and backstory of that place than if you just have an NPC explaining the history of the location. Even if you have those environmental cues along with that NPC, having an NPC spew out exposition that isn't needed is boring and unnecessary. The player can infer what is happening from what they see visually. Actually, speaking of unnecessary, try to determine what is really important in your game's world. Do you need to fully explain how magic works, or can you just simply call it magic and use that extra time to explain something more important? Do you have to explain what happened to that abandoned cabin, or can the player infer what happened from the visual cues? Don't waste time, because that is what will bore the player. Determine what is unique about your game, and focus on explaining that. Decomplexify your world as much as you can. Now, I'm not saying to dumb down your game's lore or plot, but I'm saying you shouldn't overwhelm the player with proper nouns or detailed explanations of every little thing if it isn't imperative to the game's world. Know what is important, and know what is less important, because when you have that level of understanding for your game, its mechanics, and its world, the player will find it so much easier and so much more fun to interact with. Simplify where possible. Believe it or not, the words you choose to use for a scene, or the words you choose not to use, have a massive impact on how the player perceives that scene and the characters that are in it. If you have a tutorial character, or a character that only gives information, you can make that information more enjoyable to digest by understanding who that character is and what information needs to be given. Understand the quirks of that character and what makes them unique, and translate that understanding into the tone of that character's dialogue. To steal an example from extra credits, consider GLaDOS. When GLaDOS speaks, it isn't only to deliver information, but to also explain a bit of the world and to show more of GLaDOS's own personality and character as well. The way a character speaks is a good way to deliver backstory as well as a good way to make that character interesting to interact with. A character's phrasing is important too, and to steal once again from extra credits, consider this example. To be or not to be, that is the question, has a completely different impact on the player over, "Hey yo dog, I was thinking about whether I should off myself." While in a literal sense, a dictionary sense, they mean the same thing, they say so much about the character and their backstory just from using different words. Consider punctuation as well. People don't constantly talk in a monotone, flat voice. They often get excited, or trail off, or ask open-ended questions. Consider your character and how they speak. Punctuation goes hand in hand with everything else mentioned here, especially phrasing. Oftentimes, game dialogue isn't voice acted, so making sure the player can read how the character would be speaking is important. Know your character, know how they talk, and use correct punctuation accordingly. Yeah, as long as there's no scrolling text, I basically think you're the greatest developer ever. Really though, pacing out your exposition is the most important thing. There are some things you just can't get away from explaining, and some things you really can't simplify, but don't give all of your info on that thing at once. Pace it out, repeat info or phrases so it keeps fresh in the player's mind, and include other things such as gameplay or comedic moments in between to break up the info. Like I said in my cutscenes video, making things shorter is better, maybe not in real life, but for pacing and writing it really is. Have some vital info, have some story beats, have some fun gameplay, then repeat. Maybe not exactly in that order, but you get the idea. The saying all things in moderation is definitely a good one to keep in mind too. Also, make sure to read your dialogue out loud. Usually saying things out loud can help identify anything that sounds strange. Ooh, also, don't have characters just say exposition that everyone in the world would already know, such as Arthur is king. Yeah, everyone would know that, he's the freaking king. One way to get around this would be using a character that doesn't know anything just like the reader. Think Harry Potter, where he's entering a brand new world and needs these new concepts explained to him. This is a pretty common way of getting characters to deliver exposition in a way that makes sense in world. However, it's really easy to do bad. Make sure having a character like this is logical. Don't just trade off one thing that doesn't make sense for another. Make the character more than just a blank slate. Have this be just one part of the character, not their whole character. Yep, that's about it for this one, my croutons. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.